uphill, and no matter what we're going through. So just special appreciation for everybody, no matter which Zoom room you were in, we're here together now, and I'm just so grateful for that. This is a very special event, and I just have to say extreme gratitude for being invited by everyone, especially hearing from Mort Levin, and just the ability to be invited in the second Memorial Ruth Segal Lecture is very special. And Naomi, to hear your words are both meaningful and inspiring. Makes me want to get up and do work in the spirit. My mother's name is Ruth. And so, I'd never had the opportunity to meet your mother. You really summoned a spirit in here. So I hope to do some justice, even just a little bit, because there clearly are big footsteps to walk in. So I am just so happy to be here. I am a Philadelphia native. I grew up in Mount Airy. I from a very young age, meaning nursery school, went to Germantown Jewish Center. I have lived in Philadelphia much of my life, though I spent a decade elsewhere. And I lived in Southern California. I did a PhD at the University of Michigan, lived in Washington, D.C., and spent some time in the city of Berlin. And I moved back to Philadelphia in about a decade ago. And I now live around the corner from where I grew up. So you kind of, it goes with the spirit of time moves in circles. And so but in my time in Philadelphia, I used to live right down the street from the William Penn House in Rittenhouse Square, and then in Graduate Hospital. And so while we are not that far away from each other, and I would of course prefer to be in the same room and be able to vibe and share energy with you, I feel like this, we're working with what we have. So and I also recognize, I don't know if all of you have had this experience of how to keep time during the pandemic. A friend of mine said, I asked what day it was, and he said it was Blur's Day, like it's all a blur. So I think the fact that we're here and it's December, and sometimes you got to look at the calendar twice to figure out what day it is, I think it says a lot about our spirit, that in a very challenging year, no matter how much we're working on keeping it together, that we can be here tonight. So I have to say, I'm very inspired by all of you here. So my goal, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to talk through this just so I don't, okay, so you should be able to see an introductory screen, and you may recognize what's here. I'm gonna go through a slide deck, and my hope is to do the following. I wanna kind of just give you a little bit of sense of who I am and how I see the city. I'm a historian and an art curator, but I have a very particular kind of way of seeing the city, so I'll try to share that. I wanna give a little bit of context, just a bit, about our monument debate, the monument conversation happening in the country right now. And I won't be able to cover everything, but I do really want to give you a little bit of a sense of kind of how I see it. And then I'm going to share with you the work of Monument Lab. And I don't know if anyone here has ever seen the public exhibitions that we've done in Philadelphia, or come to any of our events or listen to our podcast, but my hope is to give you a little bit of a glimpse of the kinds of work that we do. And really, our goal is to really thoughtfully engage the monuments that we have inherited from past generations and to help unearth the next generation of monuments through stories of social justice, resilience, resistance, and hope. And I'll start again, I've shared a little bit about my backstory. And I think, another thing I would just share, I was a journalist. I was a researcher before I went to graduate school. I did urban studies at Penn as an undergrad, and then did a PhD in American culture. What is American culture, you might ask? It's a kind of combination of history, literature, and art. And I remember reading a book that was really influential to me while I was writing my dissertation, and it was a scholar by the name of Joseph Roach. And he said, when you study history, it's not that historians should abandon the archives, but they should spend more time in the streets. And so I take that spirit, and just to open up with the first slide I have up here and give you a fuller sense, if you don't recognize this, or maybe you do, this is the President's House on Independence Mall. And I bring this up in part, Philadelphia is known as the home of democracy. And I would just say, in the spirit of social justice, we are a home of democracy, but we also have had an imperfect record in terms of democracy. We have been striving and struggling toward democracy. And just quickly, Jean, I see your question. Yes, this is the Monument Lab that we partnered with Mural Arts a few years ago, and you'll see some glimpses of that later on. So in Philadelphia, and again, I'm sorry if anyone has heard this story, but I want to kind of share this because here we have one of the most important sight lines in our history on Independence Mall. And several years ago, as the National Park Service was excavating the land right here along Market Street, they were rebuilding a pavilion for the for the Liberty Bell. And when they did that, they discovered archaeological remains. They found the first residence for the first president of the United States, George Washington. And when you find in Philadelphia, the birthplace of American democracy, the first presidential residence, you will also find, because of that time period and the people we're talking about, the first presidential slave quarters. Because as we know, many of our founders and architects of American democracy were also enslavers. And whether they wrestled publicly with that question or not, it is part of our history. And so at first, the National Park Service said, and I'm really paraphrasing and condensing here, but you get a point. Well, let's not tell that story about freedom and slavery here. We're celebrating the Liberty Bell after all. And it was the work of activists, it was the work of historians, and it was the work of community members that said, wait a second, let's actually tell the story together. Let's make sure that we're not trying to gloss over. The story may have not been told before, it might, but we have to tell the story. And so it's a really remarkable case because in a country that has no national memorial to slavery, it has no national reparations program for the legacies of slavery and the profound impacts, we know of that. This is arguably one of the most national sites that marks our history of slavery. And so there's all these different elements here, and if you do venture outside of the house, you can see this from a socially distanced way. It's not inside. There's the outlines of the residence that are recreated. There are archaeological remains encased in glass. And there are the names of over half a dozen enslaved African Americans who toiled there. And part of the kind of history lesson that I got by seeing this site, it was opened in 2010 under former President Obama, though it had been in the works for almost 20 years, is that, in Pennsylvania, there was a law on the books that said if you were brought here as an enslaved person from a state that had legalized slavery, you would be held here for up to 6 months in bondage before you would be automatically freed and gain your freedom. And so George Washington and Martha Washington planned for the enslaved African Americans to be here and then be brought back to Mount Vernon in Virginia, short of that 6-month period, so that their enslaved people would not gain freedom. There's a remarkable story, a book I highly recommend by a mentor of mine and actually someone I grew up with, Erica Armstrong Dunbar, called Never Caught. It is the story of Ona Judge. It's a remarkable book. It's going to be made into a movie. I bring this up because I think this is an important viewpoint to talk about our monuments. Sometimes we hear people talk about monuments and the debate like, oh, well, monuments equal history. And I want to say sometimes they do, but monuments, as we know them, have often told us a small sliver of our story. And so what if we have more of an approach to understanding not just the things that we say we're proud of, but the challenges? And what if monuments were not places that we tried to keep frozen in time, But like here, the president's house, they could be spaces of coming together, of learning, so that if you're a visitor to the Liberty Bell, you have to walk through this site. Just one other anecdote before I dive fully in. As Mort mentioned, I wrote a book called A Wall of Our Own, An American History of the Berlin Wall. It's a story of American artists and writers who spent time in Berlin while the wall was up to think about division and freedom at home, especially racism, sexism, and Cold War politics. And, I spent a lot of time in Berlin. I did not grow up in my Jewish community in Mount Airy dreaming of going to Germany, to be honest with you. We kind of said, like, don't go to Germany. It's too much of a site of trauma. And despite all of that, I went as a college student, as a grad student, and I actually found that despite the heavy burden of history that the German society has, the scars of the past were on the surface of the city. And there were Holocaust memorials as big as city blocks and as small as cobblestones. And I have to say, I felt more comfortable being Jewish in Berlin than I did anywhere else in Europe, because they weren't just trying to not tell the truth. They were struggling with it. And every conversation I had, and I learned about the public education program, and I learned about reparations paid to Jewish families, and I saw these memorials. So I just think, in Germany, there are no, it's illegal to have a swastika. There are no Nazi memorials. And so I think about how that understanding can help us perhaps be truer and deeper in our storytelling and open up new possibilities to move forward. So one of the things that is big on my plate, I'll say I was trained to be an academic and be a writer, and I started with Monument Lab, and it was a classroom conversation that really started it as a professor at Penn finishing my dissertation. And it spilled out to be a public exhibition, a public studio, and now is a national and international project. And so we really went from being a passion project, a group of people coming together to talk about the past, present, and future of monuments. And now we're more of an organization, and we got our biggest opportunity yet through the Mellon Foundation. The Mellon Foundation just announced that they are investing $250 million, that's $250 million, to telling a fuller story in our national monuments. And Monument Lab, the organization that I run, we're so grateful. We are the first recipient of a grant right here in Philly. We did it. Now we have our work cut out. But what we're doing first is doing a national monument audit. That audit is going to take in every data source about monuments that exists. So on the federal, state, local level. And I just got off a call with our team. We have a team all over the country doing like we're doing Zooming. And let me tell you, you ever open up a drawer that you think has all your wires and your stuff and everything is in a knot and you're like, oh gosh, I'm just going to close that door and not look at it? That's like the monument data, because no one has been keeping track of it in the same way across every city, every state. Every place defines monument differently. Every state has some information, but not a lot of information. And what we're trying to do is, in our work, have a conversation nationally that actually has us take a look at what are the monuments we've inherited? What do we know about them? What did we know about demographics? How can we dive deep into some of these areas? We're partnering with a lab at MIT that studies street names. So I put this out there as a big picture of where we are now. And as I'll talk through in my lecture, I'm going to tell you how we got here in our thinking as well. So as we talk about monuments today, I want to just show you these images. They are drone shots. And I saw them on Instagram over the summer, taken by a photographer in Richmond, Virginia. And if you know anything about Richmond, Virginia, it's kind of all the places in our country and the world debating monuments, Richmond is a capital of the culture war, which is really what it is. Because Monument Avenue is this miles-long landmark, and it was built originally as a real estate development dating back to the 1890s that was imagined as a whites-only segregated neighborhood. And the way that they enforced it and advertised it from 1890 forward was putting larger-than-life monuments to Confederate lost cause generals. And this is starting in 1890, moving through the 1920s, We are 40 years after the defeat of the traitorous Confederacy. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy and other city leaders, Richmond is not alone in its dedication of Confederate lost cause monuments. But Richmond's Monument Avenue kind of held a special place. It was the capital of the Confederacy. This summer, as a reckoning was happening all across the country around monuments, the city of Richmond, within the state of Virginia, there was all these things happening. Of course, activists reclaimed some monument spaces. The state passed a law reversing a century-old ban on local cities and towns deciding what to do with their monuments. And that was an effort by the state government to hold the status quo, to protect Confederate monuments. Just for a second, think back. Our country has more has had and continues to have more Confederate monuments than abolitionists, right? That, or enslavers to abolitionists. So we're not used to it. We're not used to a picture like this, a before and after of a Robert E. Lee statue on Monument Avenue. And the left, white marble, pristine, has been there since 1890. And a site on the right, which is, people have reclaimed it and occupied it. And I think, I've been there myself with my mask and social distancing. It's one of the most remarkable monument sites I've ever seen. It actually reminded me of the Berlin Wall, that a site of previously divisive infrastructure that was up for generations was reimagined as a place for freedom, not just to erase the struggle of the past, but to leave your mark. And I have to say, the New York Times, there's one, in addition to the 4 Confederate generals who were up, there was one more recent attempt, a little bit of an aberration, to African-American tennis player Arthur Ashe, a Richmond native. The New York Times named this site, as it stands now, the most important piece of protest art since World War II. And they said that because there's something going on here that's not happening in most of our monuments. It's not pretty always. There's beautiful things about it, but it's not traditionally pretty. It has profanity on it. It is unwieldy. You can see the grass even grew greener when people didn't feel welcomed to be there. But when I was there, I saw intergenerational, multiracial groups of people taking pictures, surveying the scene. There's a garden, there was voter registration, there are projections at night. And truly what's happening there is a different kind of safety in public space. It's the safety to not have to tell the lie. It's the safety to say we are a work in progress as a nation. And that's one of the reasons why I feel like this is incredibly important to learn from. The late Nobel laureate Toni Morrison in 1988 and then 89 was sharing her perspective of why she wrote the book Beloved. And this is something I read as a student, and I teach it every semester, and I find it remarkable, and I'll just read it to you. Toni Morrison, when asked about why she wrote the novel Beloved, which is a story about slavery, she said, "There's no place you or I can go to think about or not think about, to summon the presence of or recollect the absence of enslaved people. There's no suitable memorial or plaque or wreath or wall or park or skyscraper lobby. There's no 300-foot tower. There's no small bench by the road. There's not even a tree scored an initial that I can visit or you can visit in Charleston or Savannah or New York or Providence, or better yet, on the banks of the Mississippi." Because such a place doesn't exist, the book had to. Now, when Toni Morrison said that in 1989, and we look at history, there are places that we can go, right? There's the President's House on the Mall. There's a national park site dedicated to Harriet Tubman. The point stands, though, there is no national memorial to slavery. The fact that this week we are celebrating the anniversary of the 13th Amendment, the end of enslavement. And we don't celebrate that, but we celebrate other holidays. That is something, right? But I think what's powerful about Toni Morrison's notion here, one, she gives a laundry list of all the kinds of monuments and memorials that exist. Some of them are as mundane as a wreath or a plaque or a skyscraper lobby. I think of the fact that William Penn House is named after a person, a building, right? That's another place to name. But what I love when she says there's no small bench by the road, after she said this, a group within the Toni Morrison Society started dedicating small benches by the road at places of racial trauma and racial transformation all across the country. And in fact, at Toni Morrison's memorial service at the Apollo Theater, they put out a bench for her. And just think about if you're walking through Rittenhouse Square, if you ever take moments to read those little plaques. So there's this everyday vernacular form. And I just feel like, you know what that project does? It doesn't try to erase Toni Morrison's sentiment. It doesn't try to prove her wrong. It created space so that all across the country, we could actually have those spaces. And if there's more of them, so be it. There's another quote I want to share from another novelist. And I would say, as a historian, sometimes you read a novel and you get a more fine-grained understanding of history. This is Zadie Smith, who's a British author of mixed race heritage. And she gave an address in the city of Berlin in 2016, days after President Trump was elected in 2016, and the New York Review of Books reprinted it with the picture of Angela Merkel and former President Obama, and I just love that photo. And she's sharing a story about walking in Berlin with her father, and her mother is Black and her father is white, and he was a liberator of the Bergen-Belsen camps. And they walk through Berlin, and she says, we're such the odd couple, me and my father, and they're making sense of all these sites of memory, and it summons her to say something about history. And she says, this is the world that I know. Things have changed, but history is not erased by change. And the examples of the past still hold out new possibilities for all of us, opportunities to remake for a new generation the conditions from which we ourselves have benefited. Progress is never permanent, will always be threatened, must be redoubled, restated, and reimagined if it is to survive. I bring this up, it's inspiring, it's not easy, it's sobering, but I think what Zadie Smith helps us understand is that history's changes are not inevitable and they're not permanent. And while we have an attitude and an idea about monuments as somehow permanent, the end point, I use this in my work to really think about how are monuments bridges between the past and the present, or maybe portals, that they're ongoing points of understanding. Because if truly monuments are supposed to mark progress in some way, but our progress is not permanent and must be rekindled and carried across generations, well, we got to have monuments to help us do that. So this is context I want to share, and I'm going to now pivot and go to the work of Monument Lab. And again, as I noted, we really began in the classroom. Myself and my co-founder, Ken Lum, were teaching classes. We worked with our students. We spilled out of the classroom because when you're studying monuments, you got to go outside. And we used Philadelphia as our textbook. And while Monument Lab now works in many other cities like St. Louis and Newark, New Jersey, and New York, and in Toronto and elsewhere, Philadelphia is where we're rooted, where most of our team is based, and for our work as a nonprofit, where we situate ourselves. And we, because we're, I say this lovingly, we're word nerds. We care about the words we use. We had to come up with early in our work a definition for monument that was based on the way that we heard from people. Because in our work, we would set up public installations in public spaces and have conversations with hundreds of thousands of people and gather their information and pull it together as data. And so we came up with this definition. A monument is a statement of power and presence in public. That includes bronze and marble, statues and figures, but we realized that when people say monument, they also mean art and murals and protest and poetry. And it showed us that, look, if you have the time, the money, and official recognized power, you can build a monument that is important to you. But if you do not have time, money, or official forms of power, you gather next to a monument that exists, or you build your own. And that's the way you make your presence felt. And I think in many ways, when we wonder, well, why are monuments such lightning rods for controversy or struggle? It's because, you know what? They're the tip of the iceberg when it comes to our democracy. It's much harder to dive into the bureaucracy of government. than it is to go set up shop next to a monument. And also, I just want to say the monuments that we see, they're not delivered from on high. They're not permanent in of themselves. Someone put them out there and made a claim that they belonged. And so I don't know if for every monument in the news, there's another 100 or so that you might walk by or drive by every day and they just kind of float in the background. How'd they get there? Who put it there? You ever have a piece of furniture in your living room and all of a sudden the light just comes in and all of a sudden you see it and you're like, oh, that's there? I think a lot of our monuments are like the furniture of our living rooms. And how would we re-engage those spaces, right? So Monument Lab now has a process that we use. We try to do it in every project. And, you know, we're not a government agency. The words monument and lab sound very official. But we have now increasingly, we do work with municipal governments, state governments, museums, but we also, our heart is with teaching. And so we work with young people, we work with intergenerational groups, we kind of engage, and this is a lot of what we do. We like to question. We always have a question at the center of our projects that doesn't have one answer. It has a multitude of possibilities. We like to connect with people. We like to unfix the idea of a monument, to unfreeze them. We build prototypes. We are increasingly helping with long-term enduring projects, but we like to build prototypes to kind of open up imagination. And then we report out what we find in books and newspapers and publications. So, you know, as mentioned, you can get a copy of our book at almost any bookstore. I heard it's on display at the Shakespeare and Company on Walnut. I know it's at Joseph Fox, which is a big treat. But we also have a bunch of newspapers that we, and maps and zines that you can download for free on our website. Pardon me. And that's the thing, we like to circulate different kinds of materials because we are writers and readers as well. And part of that idea of cultivating conversations come from this. Of the work that we've done over the years, and I want to point out, these are works that are temporary, that are worked on with artists. And I think, Jean, you pointed this out, that a lot of the images I'll show you are from a 2017 exhibition that we produced with Mural Arts in the city of Philadelphia. In the 5 center squares of the city and 5 neighborhood parks and the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts and the Barnes Foundation. And I'm showing these because you might recognize some of the places. These sculptures are not up right now. They were up temporarily, but they have continued to play a part in the imagination of Philadelphia and other cities. And I think that's the goal that I want to point out to you is like, how could these prototype our approaches to monuments in the future? And so here is an example of one of my favorites from the artist Karen Olivier, who's a professor also at Temple. We ask how monuments reflect us today. Well, she made that literal. She covered the Battle of Germantown Monument in a mirror so that it would reflect everything around it, people, foliage, light. And I have to say, you know, when she proposed this, it was a riff on an earlier moment in history when another monument in this park to Daniel Pastorius, a German colonist and one of the first people to protest slavery in what would become the United States. During World War I and World War II, the monument to him in the park was covered with a box. And Karen said, let's do that. Let's do that in this park, but let's cover this with a mirror. This monument was never vandalized. In fact, there was a person who cleaned it once a week. As a curator, you're like, uh-oh, is that gonna leave a mark? And then you gotta let go of that. This is public space. So you see, wow, people really identified with it. And it was beautiful to see. And it's an idea to think about how we, you know, as a metaphor, as well as a reality, how do our monuments reflect us? The artist Tanya Bruguera, a world famous artist, has presented at the Tate Modern, has made national headlines as a provocateur. She proposed a very traditional monument. It was elevated, it was a figure, but she said it was a monument to new immigrants. And so she wanted it to be made of unfired clay so that over time it would fall apart. Because she said, look, I want to take pride in immigrants, especially new immigrant groups, not legacy groups who have structures in Philadelphia like the Scottish and Irish. But she said, I want to also make a monument that is about absence as well and loss and what you gain and what you lose in the cycles of immigration. And so she had us do this, and by the time that the steel underneath it, the armature, would be revealed, she asked us to put another one up top. We had a few extras wrapped in wet clay nearby. And it was just about the cycles. And I have to say, I got text messages every day from people who walk by who were just taking moments to pause and think. The truth is, all of our monuments in one way or another would look like this if they didn't have maintenance money keeping them up. In fact, the Smithsonian magazine did a study a few years ago of tracing $40 million of upkeep to Confederate lost cause sites around the country. And so I think that this is the power of a prototype. It can shine a light on something that is maybe known but not uttered in public. And then here, the artist Mel Chin made a monument called To Me. It's a monument to me, to you, two of me, too much me. And the idea was that anyone can be a monument. Anyone can. You can go to the top. The trick is someone else on the other side is going to be there as well. Something really important to Mel, and here's a drone shot of 90 feet of ADA accessible ramp snaking behind each of these so that people could go up, and they did, in walkers, in wheelchairs, in strollers. Before the guard glass was up, before we opened, someone flew off the top of it with a bike, and I held my breath. They landed okay. But I have to say, just an insight, because a lot of my time I spend dreaming with artists and planning with bureaucrats. And I was encouraged often by very thoughtful, well-intentioned people, but who didn't have a big picture. And they said, why do you need ramps? Couldn't we put steps there? What about putting a lift on one of them and having it run a few hours a day? And I'm thankful for my team that said, that's not what access is. Access, a lot of times, is hidden, is fast track for people and take up space and show people it's not so easy to get to the top of a pedestal. And 50,000 people went to the top while this was up in the fall of 2017. I went up there a few times, and it was remarkable. You can't just take a selfie up there. You got to talk to people. You got to communicate, and that was really an amazing experience. Another project didn't build a monument per se, but worked with a monument to the stoop, Philly's and several other cities' beloved threshold between public and private space. This was in Washington Square Park, which is run by the National Park Service. And we proposed to bring salvage stoops in our building boom in Philadelphia. As the city has been remade in recent years by real estate and development, a lot of the old stoops that were quarried from stone organic to the area, it gets demolished, it gets put in the waste stream. And because Washington Square, though it's pristine now, was once a potter's field, it is a burial ground. The artist Caitlin Pomerantz brilliantly said, I want to make a space of these salvage stoops. And we removed benches, and we wondered, will people know what to do with them? Well, we watched Eyewitness News the night that we installed them, and the cement was still drying, and the do not cross tape was up, and the reporter reports live sitting on the stoop. And you'd go there every day, people were sitting there. There were wedding pictures, Pokemon Go meetups. There was a workout tape film, but also just people reading their paper. And it was really powerful. And I'd say, in a little bittersweet news, the Philadelphia History Museum collected those stoops, and they were in their collection, and they are now closed. So this question of what to do with our monuments, our hope is that a project like this can spur other ways of thinking. And this was actually honored by the Preservation Alliance. I'll get through this and close in a moment in time for questions. Not all the projects we do are sculptures. Some are light, some are sound. The artist Michelle Angela Ortiz, a brilliant Philadelphia, South Philly artist, wanted to make a monument to mothers who were detained in an immigrant family prison outside of Philadelphia. Because City Hall, if you see the 200 sculptures on the building, include a lot of figures who came to Philadelphia to seek a better future before there was a Philadelphia, including William Penn. And so Michelle built relationships with women who were being imprisoned by the state, and worked with mothers and their children to tell their stories in public, and then organized with groups like Juntos and the shutdown Berks Detention Center campaign as a part of her project on City Hall, a moving animation. This is a still. The Artist Clip Collective in Marconi Plaza. You might have heard about it because there's a giant box over a Christopher Columbus statue. A few years ago, we made a monument to South Philly's families. You know, a lot of people in this city, no matter what your ethnicity or race is, may have a South Philly story. My great-grandparents naturalized at the Coast Guard station. They escaped pogroms in Eastern Europe and had a pushcart and then a small Jewish deli at 2nd and Christian. So for this project, we gathered the surnames, the last names from shipping manifests, from census records, from the stories of African-American migrants in South Philly, and from recent immigrants and refugees who are Mexican-American, Vietnamese, Laotian, Cambodian, Nepalese, and created a walkthrough that you could walk through and see a wave of names. And this was a special event, but you can imagine this is the kind of thing that you could make often, right? And be able to not look for one single individual, but a group. And it's just a reminder, history, we know history doesn't happen because some person rides into town on a horse and looks off into the distance. It's because of all the people, all the names, all the groups. So this is a reminder of the collectivity of history. And then finally, because poetry is a voice of our city. I don't know if you know the poet Ursula Rucker. She is one of my dear friends and collaborators. And we worked with her and a sound artist, Emeka Ogbo, to create installations on the roof of the Free Library and throughout Logan Circle, solar-powered poetry stations. They recorded an epic poem about Philadelphia, and you could plug in with your headphones at any time and hear this. It's like the idea, the pulse of the city is always going. And so this was one of my favorite projects. It's not monumental because it's huge or permanent. It's monumental because it speaks to who we are. Ursula Rucker says in the poem, "We are our own monuments." I love that idea. Just a few final slides. You know, I talked about this, the lab of Monument Lab. We do participatory research. We theorize public space while in public space. We've hired high school students. We've hired artists, teachers, and educators, and college students work with us. And we gather monument proposals and monument maps. A lot of the work we do, I mentioned the word data, we like on the front end to actually collect with pieces of paper, because if you try to fill out a form online or you got your Zoom link and it's don't have the right thing, it breaks. So paper is a way to lower the threshold for involvement. And then it's on us to put that into the cloud. We've just put out a monument field trip that anyone can do from the safety of your own apartment or home, or masked in public. Again, a paper form, but the idea is that we can use the environment we have. We can encourage people to think about the monuments we've inherited, and we can do work on big and small ways to help imagine the next generation of monuments. I want to close with two final thoughts, and then be excited for some questions before we close out the evening. So, you know, I was thinking about this idea of permanence. It's a word we use in the art world in many ways. We also might even use it in our notions of social change. And this is a tough pill to swallow. I've been having a debate with my mother, Ruth, about this, so maybe we can continue it. There is no such thing as permanent public art. As I said, monuments have the aura of permanence. We talk about them as eternal, but we know that they require maintenance and mindsets to keep them up. So what if our goal was to not have the word permanent, but what else would we use? Would it be enduring? Would it be generational? Would we actually have to build in points for revision, right? Rather than thinking about toppling a monument and is it good or a bad, what if we built our monuments not as places to say we're done with history, let's put our heads in the sand, but to say, I want to pass the torch. I'm going to the next step. And therefore, even in your own lifetime, you can return and see how something like a monument progresses. So I know it's tempting. Like I get calls, we have commissions from museums and cities around the country, and they're like, well, what about saying permanent? I have to like bite my lip, and I'm saying like, okay, well, maybe it's there for 50 years. What happens after 50 years? How do we build that in? Because I think if you take this away from public art and you do it to politics, we can't even assume that in 4 years, political policies would be kept in place. So how can we imagine a generation? And I think this is where multi-generational, multiracial groups of people can communicate and really figure out how we learn from one another. And then finally, something I want to say, because sometimes people differentiate between monuments and memorials, and I think it's an academic difference, because there's a lot of monuments that are about pride, but you could read the moments of loss or loss of life that are a part of it. And memorials are places of resilience as well. This is an image from one of our Monument Lab fellows, people that we try to support around the country in Baltimore, working on a monument pedestal that used to have Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson on it. So I think, what if we thought of our public spaces and our monuments as places where we balance presence and absence, where we figure out loss and resilience? We're in the midst of a catastrophic pandemic. And we're in a reckoning around racial justice. And so I get asked a lot by news outlets, like, well, what's a monument going to look like for the pandemic? And I say, well, the last pandemic that we had in 1918, which my great grandmother died in South Philly, caring for the family, there's no memorial. There's no historic plaque. The Mutter Museum just did an exhibition about it. How is it possible? More soldiers died of the influenza in 1918 than they did in conflict of World War I. So I think, what if we have an approach where we say, look, we are a country, we're a city where we are proud of our history and we're struggling with our history. And we want to make space, not just for the heroic stories that are traditional, that have gotten their place in bronze and marble, or in the history books, or in documentaries, or in holidays, and you can go on. What if we also think about whose stories have not been there? Or another way to say it is, for every great figure you see on a monument pedestal, that one person, who are the people who made it possible for that person to be there? Who was their caretaker as a child? Who did they collaborate with? If they were an enslaver or a colonizer, whose lives were lost or toiled, right? At the same time, if you can imagine, like in our city of Philadelphia, where we have a real discrepancy of who gets monuments, because there's only one full figure statue to a person of color on city land. It went in 2017, despite a few other smaller structures that face the street. That's a cold reality. But if you count our murals, if you count our historic markers, if you count these other programs, you can see that we know that the diversity of our history is far more complex and more storied. So as we move forward, and I close, I ask us, how will we make room for a fuller story? One that is uniting, but it's also making sure that we don't repeat the errors of the past, where we didn't tell a full story. And so this is the spirit that I close, to say, we want to inherit, we want to imagine creative ways to deal with the monuments we've inherited on all fronts. And we also want to work together in coalitions across the city, across many cities, across places, across experiences, to unearth and imagine the next generation of monuments. And on that note, I say thank you.
Thank you, Paul. On behalf of everyone here, we also really express our appreciation for you taking the time to be with us this evening. Once again, I apologize for the snafu at the beginning with the Lincolns, but for those of us who endured that time and that wait, listening to you was certainly made it worthwhile. We'll open it up to any questions. Either you want to try raising your hand or put something in the chat so I can see.
Yeah, and we have a few in the chat, and we'll try to get to a few. And I recognize, we'll try to get in through as many as possible. Thank you, Jean. I put an email to Monument Lab. We'd love to see something for our archives. It's always a treat. I've talked to so many people who say, "Oh wait, you did that thing? Oh, I have a picture of my daughter in that space," or, it's really great. So appreciate that. So next big thing in Philly, I got something up my sleeve. So I will share it with you. We haven't announced all of it, but why not give a little bit of a sneak peek? So there are two things that we're doing, and you can imagine, like, we're planning art in a pandemic. So we always value public art and public health, but that is factored in our minds. So there are two things that we're unveiling this year in Philadelphia. One of them is an app on your phone. And I'm going to tell you now, because sometimes apps let our, by the way, the Zoom challenges we had here, I have those Zoom challenges every single day with people all over the place. So if there's anything that is actually the great equalizer, it is Zoom challenges. But that being said, we're working with this amazing group of technology builders, and we're making an app that's going to create an experience that you can do if you're willing to be outside or it's safe enough to be outside. It's called Overtime. And the idea is that anyone we want to test it in one place, and we'd love to do it in many others, where you see a place over time. And there's a little bit of a like overtime, like it's meant to be, we like to put the fun in fundamental. And so we're going to disclose a location somewhere not too far from William Penn House. We spent time with our research team this summer trying to find all of these histories. Some of them are really clear to the monuments and the art that you might see there, and some are lesser known, and let you on your own phone, on your own time, go experience and walk through an outdoor museum. So that is, we're actually filming it tomorrow in a studio with everyone in their masks and a green screen. And then it's going to be ready for the public in the early part of 2021. We think in March, because no matter how many nice days we hopefully will have this winter where we can hang out outside safe, we know we got to take till the spring. So early March, that's coming. And then May 1st, we are opening our next Philadelphia exhibition. We haven't done a Philadelphia exhibition in 3 years. We did one in Newark, New Jersey, and St. Louis last year. And we're partnering with a remarkable group called the Village of Arts and Humanities. And if you've ever known them, if you don't know them, look them up. They're over 30-year-old organization in North Philly. And they're both an art hub. They are a community provider. They manage the business district. This year, as more and more Philadelphians went hungry, they were a food handoff spot for produce. We're partnering with them with several artists from North Philly, including MacArthur Genius Award winner Deborah Willis, Black Quantum Futurism, and several artists from around the world, and doing a project. It's called Staying Power. And it's a project, like when we think about a monument, this is really about monuments in neighborhoods and what is the life of a neighborhood. And so we are working with an amazing group of artists. We're going to have a series of performances that are open to the public. We have a few neighborhood fellows who we're going to mentor, but also they're going to be producing work. And just so you know, we are planning this on a few tracks because it's May 1st. And who knows what's going on with the vaccine? We don't know, or any of this stuff. So we're planning for a mostly outdoor exhibition. And if, we're, God forbid, in a situation where it's really not safe to be around there, or we want to build it, like, let's say you don't feel safe, we're going to have an online way to engage with this. All of our programs will be live streamed. But we also will have opportunities for tours on site to see artwork and to see it. And there will be sculptures, and there will be photo installations, and there'll be storefront. And it's really going to be exciting. And the last thing I'll say for our work in Philadelphia is, we do a lot of different programs that we used to just do in Philadelphia. Now we do across the world and across the country. One of the best ways to keep in touch with us is to join our mailing list. If you go to monumentlab.com, on the bottom of the page, you can get on the mailing list, and you can see all of our information and support our work and download our podcast. But I say that because while those are two big events coming in Philly, we're always responding to the moment. And so you never know, like I get calls all the time, every week, from a college or a university or a public space entity. And so we're always eager to partner. So that's a long targeted answer about Philly. Lou T asked, do you think monuments should also name the bad things that our cultural heroes stand for, like Jefferson and Washington Memorial in Washington, which do not highlight their slave holdings? Yeah, I think this is a really important question, and I don't think there's a single fixed answer. A few weeks ago, I also heard a great piece on 60 Minutes featuring the historian Erica Armstrong Dunbar. And she was asked, like, what do we do with all of our monuments to these imperfect figures who are nonetheless important to American democracy? And she said, look, like, I get why at a historic site like Mount Vernon or in Germantown, Philadelphia, why there's a statue or a marker for George Washington, but why is he in every single park? I thought that was interesting because I felt like, well, on its surface, that seems like why wouldn't you have those? Well, we also know how our monuments have not always represented our full histories. I think that a lot of really interesting techniques are being developed about how to coexist monuments. I think right now this summer, it feels like we only have two options: keep up the monuments or tear them all down. What do you want to do with that? And I think the work of Monument Lab tries to, before a clash in a public space, open up a lot of possibilities. Because I would love to see, I think the President's House is a great example on Market Street that honors George Washington and asks critical questions. And the point of that spot is to reckon with slavery. You can go to other places around Philadelphia area, if not the East Coast, and see sites that don't tell the story of slavery. But what could we do? They could be, of course, extra signs, but I'm interested, maybe you commission a second monument next to that monument. Maybe you move that monument. Maybe there's an alteration. There's a light projection at night. There's an additional inscription. Monuments are changed over time. They're moved all the time. I had a call from a college campus in the Midwest recently who has a Lincoln statue, and they are, the issue with the Lincoln statue is actually nothing to do with the Civil War or slavery. It's about Lincoln's participation as a militiaman in a conquest of the local native people. And so we said, all right, well, one of the first things we could do is let's ask their descendants of these native people to give us their opinion and maybe have common ground. And what I find when you get out of the heat of the moment and you actually did listening, especially to people who have been historically harmed by those sites or excluded, all the creativity is possible. So I don't think it's an either or, and I hope over the next few years, we have more of a vocabulary and an imagination for how we layer the past and the present. Jean asks, are you national? Are you still connected to mural art? So the first answer is yes, we work across the nation. We're rooted in Philly. This is our home. Most of our staff is based here, but we are increasingly doing work in and out of Philadelphia. And so I've gotten some interesting calls from people outside of the United States. We're doing a project in Toronto next summer. I don't even know if I can go. The borders are closed right now. So the best Toronto memory I got, we're trying to work with, but luckily we have a great team there. Whenever we do projects elsewhere, we have most of our work is rooted here, and then we build additional collaborators who are local. And then with mural arts, we are friends with mural arts. We're not officially connected to them anymore. We had a great collaboration. I also personally was their first scholar in residence a few years ago, and have curated guest projects for them on and off. We have a lot of love. I actually have coffee with Jane once every other month still. And I think what I've learned from mural arts, like we've learned so much from them, is when you picture Philadelphia now, you picture murals. That is the product of tireless work. If you look behind the stories of murals, the process matters, who participated. So I think as we do our work, we still learn a lot from the legacy organizations. I would say too, for us, we've always been a partner. So we bridge across partners. There is no big monument lab. Sometimes people call us and say, I'd like to tour the facility or the monument factory. And I'm like, just so you know, I went full-time as an employee in October of this year. It was always a labor of love. We have a lot of people on our team who are like so awesome, and their genius didn't fit in their full-time job. So they would do this as extra work, and we're now able to hire some of them. But just to give a sense, like we've never had, we didn't have a bank account until the beginning of this year to be able to collect donations. Our mission was to focus on the work. And now we're trying to cultivate that we can survive. We are starting to get commissions for work through the year 2026. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do that? Okay, so we got to really plan, and we got to make sure we keep innovative and keep connected. But we also are evolving. And so we have great groups like Mural Arts to look at and model ourselves on. Michelle asks, what is the best way to present monuments so that they do not erupt into antagonistic battles and vandalism? Yes. Okay. So in 2017 and then 2018, okay, this is going to turn into a little I told you so. So I don't want to go. Let me start over, and then I'll end there. Sometimes there is an eruption of public dissatisfaction. Some people call it people-powered commemoration. Some people call it vandalism. It's not the tool. It's not in my toolkit. It's not the thing that you'll see me doing, but I do support some people and learn from people who have done it. And they've often done it under great duress. It's not a casual thing. They make a decision after many years or many months of engagement and feel like they have to do something, like that the monuments are not silent. They're screaming at them, right? There's some kind of thing. So I say that. I also say in most of the cities where there are monument takedowns or topplings, it's not a surprise. June 2020 is not a surprise. And in fact, in our great city of Philadelphia, the Frank Rizzo statue as an example, maybe we could put the Columbus one in there too. We knew that it was contentious. It's not just that it's Frank Rizzo left a legacy that for some people was law and order, and for other people was harassment and brutality. It's that it's on the front steps of the municipal services building. That's the front steps of the city. That's where you go to get your services. That's right at City Hall. And so to have a figure who is literally larger than life there looming over you, it sends a message that many people took note of. Monument Lab called it out in our report to the city. But in 2017, when we did our citywide project, the city had already completed their own process of asking thousands of residents to weigh in on what should happen with Rizzo. They modeled it in large part after a Monument Lab exercise with the ability to kind of dream up what's possible. And in 2017, the city's administration said that that place was deemed inappropriate and the steps would be taken to remove that statue. Okay, 2017, early 2018, we get our first backtrack from a mayor who I have a lot of respect for. I really do respect Mayor Kinney. And he's normally and historically been actually a pretty big visionary in terms of monuments. He was an early supporter of the Octavius Catto monument, also a supporter of the president's house. But he started to kick down the monument debate about Rizzo down, like, oh no, that's gonna happen next year. He said in 2018, I have 100 other priorities than that. So I thought, okay, maybe he's waiting to be reelected. And then he gets reelected in 2019, and again, kind of publicly poo-poos the idea. And I think the difficulty is when you have a mayor who has a platform, even though he had validated the will of the people before, it just put everyone in a bad spot to say, like, wait, what is happening? I wrote an op-ed in the Inquirer in 2019, and like I think this week last year, saying, what's going on? Why are we bungling this again? So I look at that example. I think about the Christopher Columbus statue, which already had been in conversation for the last several decades as a site to think about. That's not even our only Christopher Columbus statue, not our only one. I think that there are ways, and I've seen it in several other cities, and hopefully this gets to some of the heart of your question, where mediation, mitigation, and work that happens before the public clash opens up possibilities. The city of LA has a Christopher Columbus statue that was removed, and there was great solidarity built between the Native American community and the Italian American community. And just to be clear, those are not monolithic groups. There are Italian Americans in LA who did not partake. There are Native Americans who did not. But it happened outside of a moment of great social tension. This summer, I had these wonderful and surreal moments where I get called in to talk to US mayors or city council people or state administrators who are like, all right, clearly I got to deal with this. What should I do? And one of the things we say to them is don't rush to try to fix this problem, make it go away fast. You needed to do that earlier. Instead, rush to think about repair of the social fabric around this and create context so that in public, there's not a heated debate. And instead, you're creating other spaces where you can think better. But of course, sometimes it's inevitable. And sometimes this is what plays out. And we are not alone as a society in these moments. So I think listening to activists and artists and educators beforehand is one of those paths out of it. One question, was the Lincoln statue in reference to the hanging of the Lakota Indians? It wasn't directly, but yes, that's a really important part of our history that plays out throughout the Midwest and has resulted in a number of actually monument challenges in the Midwest. There was a large state execution of Lakota Native Americans that is a product of the 19th century, but is still a trauma. And I'll just say very briefly, there was a statue a few years ago put in a sculpture garden by the Walker Museum. It's like the PMA of Minneapolis. And it was a sculpture actually I personally really thought was powerful, and I had seen it in Germany when it was somewhere else, which was a statement by an artist called Sam Durant on the history of capital punishment in the United States. And it was meant to be in solidarity with and against the death penalty. And it was a really intense, like if you looked at it, it just looked like a playful structure, to be honest, but it was a recreation of infamous gallows sites across US history as a composite. Well, the Lakota tribe in Minnesota said, we were not asked about this. This is really still traumatic for us. And they said, and you know what, museum, shame on you. You knew where to find us. Could you have told us beforehand? Could we have been talked about it? I have to say, I mean, this is I'm just going fast through the story. It's worth looking at it. But one of the responses from the artist, Sam Durant, was, all right, I hear you. This was not acceptable. I am going to hand over the rights of this sculpture to you, the Lakota people here, the representatives, and you can decide what you will do with it. You think about the way art, you protect art at all costs. I believe that there was a ceremonial demolition and destruction of it, but I bring that up because the solution there was to rush to not holding on to the monument or holding on to the power or like crisis PR. It was, well, what is going to do the work of care? What is going to actually knit back together social relationships here? And I just find that fascinating. And I don't think it's usable or tenable in every single monument debate. But, I have to say a major city called me recently and asked about what to do with their Columbus statue. They wanted to take it down. They, of course, didn't know if they owned it and if they had the right to, but they knew they were in charge of caring for it. So there you go with the monument paradox. And they said, but it's going to cost so much money to take it down and store it, to figure out what we're going to do. And I said, well, what if we didn't think about it in those terms? That's a very traditional term of conservation. What if there was another way? And maybe this is where, do you have a relationship with the local indigenous tribe here that's been leading protests? It's best to find a common seat at the table. Maybe there's another way to do this, right? And so I think I get to say this, I'm not in city government. I don't have to exert in that way, but we are meant to be a place of learning and a place of dialogue so that before the heat of the moment, or sometimes during the heat of the moment, we can look toward paths where we are truthful, where we're dealing with some of the profound baggage we have as society, but we're also finding spaces for joy, spaces for catharsis, spaces for release, spaces for learning. And that is really the work of Monument Lab.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if this is slightly off the direction that you've been talking about, but I just kind of went in kind of as an ending question. This monument that appeared in Utah, do you have any?
Monolith.
I'm sorry. Okay.
The monolith.
Okay, the monolith. Do you have any insight on what that was all about?
I will tell you this. Thank you for that question, because we've been joking about it internally. We have a t-shirt store, and I thought like now's the time to make a monolith t-shirt or something on our website. So, okay, so mysteriously a few weeks ago, a monolith, meaning like a big kind of abstract structure, appeared in desert, mountainous area in Utah, and it looked like a late artist's work, and it was there. And then it was removed, and it came back, and now there's some copycat monoliths. I'm of a few minds of the monolith. So one, I like when people ask questions about public space. I would love people to ask that question of the monolith to like the average monument on your town corner, or if you have a street name, a street named after someone, I'd love you to be like, where'd that come from? You know? So I like that there's a spirit. I also have heard people that say like, why are we talking about the monoliths? Because there's so many serious things, and you know, we have other serious things. So I get that. I do believe we have the capacity to think about more than one thing at a time, but I recognize I recognize that sentiment. But you know what I think is so fascinating to me? And I have not been fully pulled into monolithomania, but I'm close. And I think it's watching how it is transformed in our culture. And it shows you how traditional public art and new kinds of public art, especially online, talk to each other. They're not different. So you have the monolith that people find by satellite image, or you have to see it in person and it becomes a historic site. Then you have memes online where people like put the monolith in a funny place that, you know, it's not there. Then all of a sudden you see, wait a second, there's artists in Romania who put up a monolith, or there's artists in France. And so you start seeing these copycats around the world, and you realize actually all of us could be making monuments in the same way and just saying, look, we have a monument. So it's like monolith is at this point a kind of playful term, but imagine if you replace that word with monument. Monuments are called monuments, not because of some official entity called Monument Lab that hereby stamped them from antiquity. Someone said, I'm making a monument, and they had power, and someone believed them, and they had access to a place, and they said, all right, that's a monument. So I like that we're playing around with who gets to express themselves in public space, and that the mystery, look, in a year that has been really challenging and brutal for all of us, and we are being as resilient as possible, if we can have it's very 2020 to experience this. And I hope it gives us, if anything, a bit of both an escape and an invitation to be engaged about what happens around us.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions.